this is this setup here. Chapter 2 of Volume 3 of Pride and Prejudice. Try to get back to it. We're going to read. Sorry, I don't have my shirt on right now. I got to show some more decorum. That's what they say in my English vocab. We have an English vocab unit. That's one of the words, decorum. To show some more decorum. This is ridiculous. But we're going to read. Elizabeth had settled it that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to visit her the very day after reaching Pemberley, and was consequently resolved not to be out of sight of the inn the whole of that morning. But her conclusion was false. From the very morning after their arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. They had been walking about the place with some of their new friends, and were just returning to the inn to dress themselves for dining with the same family, when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window, and they saw a gentleman and lady in a curricle driving up the street. Elizabeth immediately recognized the livery, guessed what it meant, and imparted no small degree of surprise to relations, by acquainting them with the honor which she expected. Her uncle and aunt were all amazement, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstance itself, and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened to them a new idea on the business. Nothing had ever suggested it before, but they now felt that there was no other way of accounting for such attentions for such a quarter than by supposing a partiality for their niece. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was every moment increasing. She was quite amazed at her own discomposure, but amongst other causes of disquiet, she dreaded least the partiality of the brother should have said too much in her favor, and more than commonly anxious to please. She naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen, and as she walked up and down the room, endeavoring to compose herself, saw such looks of inquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as made everything worse. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. With astonishment did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton, she had heard that Miss Darcy was extremely proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. She found it difficult to obtain a word from her beyond a monosyllable. Miss Darcy was tall, and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed, and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was a sense and good humor in her face, and her manners were perfectly unassuming and gentle. Elizabeth, who had expected to find her as acute and embarrassed an observer as Mr. Darcy had been, was much relieved by discerning such feelings. They had not been long together before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor, when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long away, but she still felt uneasy. It could have hardly stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He inquired in friendly, though general way after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good-humored ease that he had ever done. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, he was scarcely a less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him, the whole party before him, indeed, excited a lively attention. The suspicions which had been just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observation towards each other with an earnest, though guarded, inquiry, and they soon drew from these inquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensations they remained a little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. Elizabeth, on her side, had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own, to make herself agreeable to all, and in that latter object, where she feared most to fail, was most sure of success, for those to whom she endeavored to give pleasure were prepossessed in her favor. Bingley was ready, Georgina was angry, and Darcy determined to be pleased. In seeing Bingley, her thoughts naturally flew to her sisters, and oh, how ardently did she want to know whether any of this directed in a like manner. Sometimes she could fancy that he talked less than on former occasions, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that as he looked at her he was trying to trace a resemblance. But though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behavior to Miss Darcy, who had been set up as a rival of Jane. No look appeared on either side that spoke particular regard. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. On this point she was soon satisfied. Two or three little circumstances occurred ere they parted, which, in her anxious interpretation, denoted a recollection of Jane, not tinctured by tenderness, and a wish of saying more than led to the mention of her had he dared. He observed to her, at a moment when the others were talking, and in a tone which had something of real regret, that it was a very long time he had the pleasure of seeing her, and before she could reply, he added, "It is above 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing at Netherfield." Elizabeth was pleased to find this memory so exact, and he afterwards took occasion to ask her, when unattended to by any of the rest, whether all her sisters were in Longbourn. There was not much in the question, nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself. Whenever she did catch a glimpse, she saw an expression of general compliance, and in all that he said she heard an accent so far removed from horror or disdain of his companions as convinced her that the improvement of manners which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary its existence might prove, had at least outlived one day. When she saw thus speaking the acquaintance and courting the good opinion of people with whom any intercourse a few months ago would have been a disgrace, when she saw him thus civil, not only to herself, but to the very relations whom he had openly disdained, and recollected their last lively scene in Hunsford parsonage, the change was so great, and struck her so forcibly on her mind, she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible. Never, even in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield, or his dignified relations at Rosings, had she seen him so desirous to please, so free from self-consequence, or unbending reserve now, when no importance could result from the success of his endeavors, and when even the acquaintance of those to whom his attentions were addressed would draw down the ridicule and censure of the ladies both of Netherfield and Rosings. Their visitors stayed with them half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Miss Gardiner, and Miss Bennet, to dinner at Pemberley before they left the country. Miss Darcy, though with diffidence which marked her little in habit of giving invitations, readily obeyed Miss Gardiner, looked at her niece, desirous of knowing how she, whom the invitation was most concerned, felt disposed as to its acceptance. But Elizabeth has turned her head away, presuming, however, that this studied avoidance spoke rather a momentary embarrassment than any dislike of the proposal, and seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, a perfect willingness to accept it, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on. Bingley expressed great pleasure in the certainty of having Elizabeth again, having still a great deal to say to her, and many inquiries after all their Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, construing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and on this account, as well as others, found herself, when their visitors left, capable of considering the last half an hour with some satisfaction, though while it was passing, the enjoyment of it had little, eager to be alone, and fearful of hints from her uncle and aunt. She stayed with them only long enough to hear their favorable opinion of Bingley, then hurried away to dress. But she had no reason to fear Mr. and Miss Gardiner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. It was evident that she was better off acquainted with Mr. Darcy than they before had any idea of it. It was evident that he was very much in love with her. They saw too much interest, but nothing to justify inquiry. Of Mr. Darcy was now a matter of anxiety to think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached, there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and they had drawn his character from their own feelings, and his servant's report, without any reference to any other account. The circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known would not have recognized it from Mr. Darcy. There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and they soon became sensible. The authority of a servant who had known him since he was 4 years old, whose manners indicated respectability, was not to be hastily rejected. Neither had anything occurred in the intelligence of their Lambton friends that could materially lessen their weight. They had nothing to accuse him but of pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it would certainly be imputed by the inhabitants of a small town market, where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man, and did much good among the poor. With respect to Wickham, the travelers soon found that he was not held there in much estimation, for though the chief of his concern with the son of his patron were quietly understood, it was yet a well-known fact that on his quitting Derbyshire he had left many debts behind him, which Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and that evening, though it had passed it seemed so long, was not long enough to determine her feelings toward one in the mansion. She lay awake toward whole hours, endeavoring to make them out. She certainly did not hate them. No, hatred had vanished a long time ago. She almost as long... 7 there.